Hello, and welcome to the Intercept's Facebook live stream. My name is Benjamin Dixon, and I have been given access to take over the Intercept's Facebook page to begin a conversation with you, the viewer. I am particularly excited about this dialogue being facilitated by the Intercept. Their goal is to bring you fearless adversarial journalism. My goal in everything that I do and what I've done for the past few years is to bring you fearless and, whenever necessary, adversarial conversations, interviews, and analysis of what's happening in the world around us. It has always been necessary and important for the citizens of a nation to be informed, mobilized, and prepared to hold those in power accountable. But it is not a stretch to argue that now, more than ever before, it is vitally important for Americans to understand the nuances of the issues with which we are faced and to be able to wade through the swamp of political theater, distractions, and propaganda. Because let's face it, while people like you and me, American citizens trying to find real solutions to very real problems, while we struggle, there are some media outlets and politicians who have learned that it is highly profitable to turn discourse that should be about solutions into theatrical performances, sensationalized arguments, and debates that merely regurgitate oversimplified talking points. In other words, some of the very people whose careers should be about informing the discussion have made their careers stunting the discussion. Now, to be sure, there are deeply seated divisions in this country, and at times it may become necessary for conversations and interviews to become adversarial so that the truth can be secured and progress made. However, it's when we exchange informed discourse for sensationalized entertainment that we as commentators and journalists become hindrances to the conversation, when we of all people should be keenly aware of our responsibility to forward the conversation. And this is why I'm excited that this ongoing dialogue that begins tonight is being facilitated by an organization that is not afraid of challenging the most powerful people in the world while addressing the core of the problems that we face, not for clicks, not for entertainment, but for the advancement of all of the desperately needed conversations. That is what the Intercept does. And that's what I have always tried to do and hope to continue doing with the conversation that begins right now. Joining me first is co-founder of the Intercept and host of the podcast Intercepted, Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Thanks, Ben. And I have to say thank you for all of your great work and the dialogues and discussions you facilitated. I mean, you know, watching your sort of evolution, particularly in such a contentious time that we live, has really been heartening, but also, you know, just deep gratitude to you for the work you're doing.
Thanks, man. And thanks to you and Glenn and the entire team at the Intercept for tapping me to have this conversation with your audience. I really don't take it for granted. So if I started naming names, it would be a disaster. So let's just say the entire Intercept family.
All right. Fair enough.
And so let's talk about a couple of things. I had a chance, and let's just jump knee deep into it. And as we jump into it, I want to inform the audience that you can weigh in on the discussion at any time. You can call our voicemail 857-600-0518. You can leave a comment in the comments section and we will try to share it on screen and give you some live feedback. That's a big part of what we do here. And so with that being said, Jeremy, I had the chance to listen to Intercepted last week. And one of the things that I do on my show on a regular basis is against my better judgment, I weigh into the conversation on Syria pretty regularly. And I appreciated your episode because you shared very differing opinions from different voices, and to the point where I was pulling out the little bit of hair that I have left in some regards. And one of the things I appreciated the most about your discussion is that you framed it in a way that I truly identify with, is that, you know, trust but verify is good for citizens, but for journalists, we need to distrust and then verify, because our job is to make sure that the population, that the body politic is informed. Tell me a little bit about your general framework when you discuss Syria.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that we have this culture, particularly on U.S. cable news networks, and they're all guilty of it, some maybe more than others at different times, where I sort of call it sea monkey, analysis, where, you put the little powder into the water and boom, you have like a sea monkey there. It's instant expert, and I think that there's a tremendous lack of people who are directly impacted by particularly wars that are ever allowed onto the airwaves. So you don't hear Iraqis, you don't hear Syrians, you certainly don't hear voices from the Korean Peninsula, from Afghanistan. In fact, many of the people that are talking about these countries and really helping to shape public opinion that will determine the fate of these people, they're generals or they're pundits or they're media personalities. And I think that one of the things you learn, I did war reporting for, the better part of the last 20 years, is that when you enter into either covering a country at war or trying to analyze it, you have to have a base level of humility about it, and you have to go into it with an open mind and with open ears, particularly when you pretend to speak on behalf of people in those countries. Wow. You do that where you're going in and you want to actually listen to what people who are directly impacted by our wars think about them, or their dictatorships or repressive regimes. But also, I think that as Americans, we have a particular responsibility to hold our own government accountable. Right. And so, I give that context because when we're talking about Syria, first of all, I think Syria has become just this murderous killing field, where you have the butcher, Bashar al-Assad, who I believe is a war criminal, and I do believe he has mercilessly, intentionally targeted civilians in an effort to maintain his power. But then you also have the two most powerful military nations in the world, the United States and Russia. On the one hand, Russia is competing with the United States now for major force in the world, killing civilians. They're dropping barrel bombs. They're using, non-precision missiles. They're also giving a lot of the military support that Assad has comes directly from Moscow. The United States and Russia are simultaneously, on paper, fighting the same enemy, which is, what is broadly known as ISIS. But they have very different agendas about what they want to see happen in Syria. And under Barack Obama, there was sort of a flip-flopping that took place on whether or not Assad should be overthrown. And at the end of Obama's time in office, it seemed pretty clear that the Obama policy was that Assad remaining in power was sort of the least bad option. Trump comes into office and, has this whole sort of brokering of this fake deal with the Russians that, hey, we're both fighting ISIS, so essentially we're on the same team. And when American troops start to deploy to Syria, one of the things that we've heard from people on the ground is that they actually were positioned between Kurdish fighters that were trying to go after ISIS, but also against Assad, and then Iranian-backed forces that were fighting on the same side as the United States in Mosul. So what I'm saying here is that you have Russia, the United States, Iran, the Assad government, and then other proxy forces, Hezbollah from Lebanon, and then you have various factions of the Syrian resistance, some of which are directly related to or are actually al-Qaeda institutions, and others have a pronounced Islamist philosophy, but they're not al-Qaeda. And the United States has consistently funded groups that turn out to not exactly be on the same side as the United States. A lot of the focus right now is on, this chemical weapons issue and who was responsible for it. And there's a great debate, particularly on the left in this country, but also increasingly on the right, where you have people like Ann Coulter and other right-wing vile individuals, questioning the official story. And I think what you're referring to was, former Congressman Dennis Kucinich was on our show last week, and I asked him directly if he believed Assad was responsible for the April 4th chemical weapons attack in Idlib province, and he said no. And then I asked him if he believed that Assad had ever used chemical weapons, and he said no, but that it's up for debate. Now, a lot of people could say, "Oh my God, this is a Looney Tunes guy. Isn't he the congressman that was always talking about UFOs?" Dennis Kucinich is a serious person, and he ran he was one of the most principled members of Congress, particularly on issues of war and the Patriot Act, and he was consistently right. So I don't just dismiss him out of hand, but I do think that there is this knee-jerk reaction that we see becoming pretty prominent on the left in this country, and it's this enemy of my enemy is my friend. That if the United States seems to be wanting regime change, then we must be on the side of the regime. And to me, that's a very dangerous road to go down. And if you want to talk about the credibility of the Assad did do the chemical weapons strike and Assad didn't do the chemical weapons strike, I'm happy to tell you my thoughts on that. But I think that it's important to realize that this is a landscape filled with butchers who are doing various degrees of massacring civilians.
So you've said a lot there to unpack, and it's worthwhile. We're getting a lot of questions that we'll ask some of these questions in a moment, but I want to jump in right where you sort of left off. This knee-jerk reaction of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and this willingness on one side of the ledger to demand evidence, which I think anyone who's not demanding evidence is irresponsible. That's number one. But then if you're skeptic on one side of the ledger, how can you turn around and say, almost as a statement of faith, that you don't believe that Assad used chemical weapons at all, like Dennis Kucinich said, or to say that he didn't do this? Like, if you don't have evidence to say that he did it, then you also currently don't have evidence to say that he did not do it. So how do you address that mindset when you're doing interviews like you did with Dennis Kucinich, or when you address people who we otherwise agree with on a lot of issues?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we did on that particular show is we did interview Dennis Kucinich, and I told him straight up that I believe that Assad is a war criminal, and that I wouldn't put it past him to have been responsible or directly ordered this chemical weapons attack. Where I did, and I asked Dennis Kucinich, do you deny that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal? And he sort of paused and he said, well, no, but they're at war. And the thing is that was the line that's the line that defenders of the U.S. invasion of Iraq use, or the drone program. They say, well, it's war and civilians die. So I reject that across the board, whether we're talking about a dictator or a thug or a tyrant, or whether we're talking about someone who is technically the democratically elected leader of the United States. And I find that moral inconsistency has a place at times. But in general, it has no place. And I think that if you're going to be against this kind of mass killing on the part of the United States, which I don't think the U.S. press pays enough attention to, if we focus, for instance, this chemical weapons attack in Syria, our understanding is that it killed somewhere between 30 and maybe as many as 100 people. And the images were horrifying that we saw. But the United States is selling cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia that are killing far more people and shredding them into essentially like ground meat. And Ben, I've seen the aftermath of these kinds of strikes. And so I think it's a moment where we can also say, why is it that we pay this particular attention to this method of killing people when our own bombs are shredding people into meat across the globe? But what we did in response to Dennis Kucinich, and as I said, I think that his credibility as a lawmaker and the fact that he is representing what I think is a fairly significant number, an increasing number of people in this country that believe that there are a lot of lies being told about the Syria war. We brought on Maher Arar, who is a Canadian citizen who was born in Syria, and he's an engineer. And Maher Arar is a particularly interesting guy because he was kidnapped by the CIA at JFK Airport in the early stages of the War on Terror in 2002, and was rendered by the CIA to Syria, where he was then kept in what he called a coffin for 10 months and 10 days, and repeatedly tortured at the direction of the U.S. government by Bashar al-Assad's security forces. And Maher Arar, of course, passionately disagrees with Dennis Kucinich's view on this. He believes that Bashar al-Assad, and that there's no question that he used the chemical weapons. But he also pushed back on the left, on some segments of the left in the United States, and said, I don't want any foreign intervention in Syria. And I'm wondering why you can't find a way to both be against U.S. intervention, but also be honest about who Bashar al-Assad is. And I think that that's probably a position that many Syrians are in, where they don't necessarily want bombs raining down on their country from the United States, but they also are fed up with Bashar. And so, we as journalists can't just race to what we think, what our gut tells us is the right thing, and then proclaim that. I think it's important to have these debates. And I do think there are questions about, particularly the April 4th attack, and whether it was actually munitions that were used, whether Assad ordered it or it was other elements of his military, whether they hit a chemical weapons depot nearby, and the people that were killed got hit with residual sarin. The United Nations just, I believe today, there's a preliminary report that was released that indicates that the forensics say that there were traces of sarin or a sarin-like substance found on the victims of this attack. And I want to see that investigation taken all the way to its logical conclusion. On the other side, look, the CIA has a very long history of misinformation, disinformation, and this term gets thrown around by nutty people sometimes, but it does mean something. False flag operations, where the United States wants it to appear as though Force X did this action, when in reality it was a different faction, and that there's some chess game being played. I'm not by any means saying, oh, that's my conclusion on Syria. I'm saying we have to be really careful in how we analyze this. And if they prove the case against Assad, that should go in the list of charges against him for his, what I think should be his ultimate prosecution as a war criminal.
Okay, so we have actually quite a few questions from the Facebook chat. And if anyone wants to give a voicemail, you can call 857-600-0518, and we'll play your voicemail on air. There's a question here from Christopher on Facebook. He says, what is your take on the gas attack? It seems like it would make little sense for him to do it, as it would naturally draw the U.S. further in, as it did. It's certainly difficult to discern the truth of the matter. What's your take on that, Joe?
I think that's really an excellent question. And in fact, the director, Oliver Stone, I don't think he's an expert on chemical weapons, but he basically made that point today on Twitter and said, how on earth would this benefit Assad to do this? Ben, it's interesting. I went back, I was reading the writings of Winston Churchill, from the former British Prime Minister, who was lionized for his role as on the side of the Allies in World War II. And Churchill was an early advocate of the use of what they called gas weapons, the precursor to what we now call chemical weapons.
Right.
And if you read what Churchill said about using them against unruly or uncivilized tribes in North Africa and elsewhere, the point of it was not that it was the most effective way to kill people. It was viewed as a strategically ominous message to send to an enemy of what you could do because of the nature of the weapons. And my colleague Murtaza Hussain at The Intercept sort of made this point last week and said, it's not just about military efficacy here. It also can be part of a psychological campaign. So I wouldn't go so far in the direction of saying, why would Assad do this? It doesn't benefit him. You could look at it from a flip side and say, Assad was concerned that Trump and the United States and Russia were building this alliance in Syria, and that close relationship could result in the Russians and the United States agreeing on a successor for Assad, and Assad basically losing favor with the Russians. So there's a way in which this drove a wedge between the United States and Russia, because Russia says it was a false flag operation. They say the United States is lying. Trump launched 59 cruise missiles and said this was like one of the worst things he's ever seen in his life, which is, take that for what it is. But I do think that there is a clear way that Assad would benefit from this if his main goal is to maintain power. I will say that there are some provocative dissenters on the other side who are saying, this professor emeritus from MIT, Theodore Postal, wrote what I think is a very interesting analysis, and his conclusion is that he doesn't believe that this was a sarin gas attack. But I think, and a lot of people are sort of saying, why isn't the Intercept, agreeing with this conclusion? It's not that we're saying, oh, that guy is wrong. He certainly knows more than I do about it. It's that there are so many people on the other side and people that don't have a political agenda that are saying, no, it's pretty clear that this did happen. So, one of the projects I'm hoping we're going to start working at The Intercept is just to sort of explore the question of, if this was a chemical weapons attack, what would an actual independent investigation look like that could lead to an up or down, yes or no? Were munitions used? Was it a hit of a factory? What exactly happened here? I don't know that we'll ever resolve the issue unless we get dissenters from within the Syrian or Russian military where we would actually understand the command structure for what happened there. But I do think we can do a forensic investigation that would at least definitively conclude whether it was in fact an intentional use of these weapons.
Do you have time for about 2 more questions?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ben. I'm with you, man.
All right, not a problem. And I definitely appreciate it. I have a question here from Eric on Facebook. He said, my question would be for both of us. When is the breaking point to be pushed into war? When should a country like the United States intervene when not to directly involved or threatened? When not directly involved or threatened. I got it that time. What do you think? When should the United States intervene? Where is that threshold for you?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in, cruise missile humanitarianism, the kind that we saw practiced by Bill Clinton for the duration of his presidency. And part of the reason, I'm not some radical libertarian on these issues, but, in every case that I studied, and I speak Serbo-Croatian, I covered the war in Yugoslavia, I understand the political dynamics there. And, the United States narrative then and now remains that Clinton somehow, stopped a genocide in Yugoslavia. And that's just first of all, if that's your only statement on it, it's false.
Right.
There are times in that war when the actions of Clinton and Madeleine Albright and others actually resulted in escalating deaths in the very places that they said that they were trying to protect the population.
Yeah.
The Kosovo War, for instance, is one of the most radically misunderstood conflicts, and part of it is because the victors write the history. And the United States, at a time when it was mercilessly punishing the people of Iraq with economic sanctions in the 1990s, was funneling record levels of weapons and munitions to the Turkish government to carry out a sort of almost genocidal campaign against the Kurds, not only in Turkey, but in the countries surrounding it. And I think that the question, which is a great question, presupposes that the United States ever intervenes for purely humanitarian reasons. And I really don't believe that. So, I think that almost always when the United States intervenes militarily in the name of humanitarianism, it results in a worsening of the conflict and an escalation. I personally believe that the only wars the United States should ever be in are wars that are truly in the self-defense of people in this country, not corporations, not political authority, and not because your campaign contributors love missiles.
Absolutely. Another question.
What's your answer?
Actually, you're in the hot seat here. I agree. I think they're going to be, this is my stance. Being a non-interventionist is not a foreign policy. I think you can at ebb and flow at times. You can take a step back as a nation and say we need to look internally, we need to take care of things internally, and we don't need to engage in empire building. But there are going to be times throughout world history, we've seen it. There are times that the international community calls on the United States, or even if not the United States, they will call on a global power to have to be involved. And I agree, it should definitely be based on actual national security and not at the bidding of corporations and for the prospect of spreading empire. So that's my quick take on it. But we have one more question.
Can I say one other quick thing about that, though, Ben? What's interesting, if you study what happened in Yugoslavia with Milosevic and you look at what happened in 2003 when Saddam Hussein was overthrown during the invasion and occupation, in both of those countries, which I covered extensively, the dissidents that I would talk to on the ground, including people that were dissidents only because they're ordinary people that wanted their government changed, but also political dissidents who really had fought those regimes, some of them said, oh, yes, we want the United States to come in and we want them to overthrow Saddam Hussein, or they wanted them to bring down Slobodan Milosevic, but we don't want you to stay and we don't want you to dictate what our government looks like. If you look at what's happened in the former Yugoslavia, you have pro-fascist leaders in power in Croatia. Bosnia is an impoverished state where it's a Muslim country and they're treated like dirt by the rest of the region. And then one of Milosevic's top henchmen is in power in Serbia. What was that war all about at the end of the day? It created these ethnically pure parastates, and now with the addition of economic neoliberalism and rising kind of fascistic movements that we're seeing pop up or rejuvenate around Europe. In the case of Saddam Hussein, now this isn't my position, but I can see a reasonable argument that could have been made to say, let's lop off the head of the dragon, Saddam Hussein, and then you maintain. You go to the number 2 or number 3, and you say, are you down with the program or not? And I think that that war would have gone in a very different way. But by engaging in what they call de-Baathification and firing, 150,000 Iraqi soldiers overnight in what was a largely secular country, we created. So that's why I say that it's radically oversimplified to say, well, when would you support military intervention? When what kind of atrocity is taking place? There are so many questions to answer before that. Like, is there a diplomatic road?
Right.
What would the world look like if the United States actually supported an international criminal court that would have jurisdiction over every country, including the United States, Britain, Israel, and its allies? Then you could start viewing the handling of despots and thugs and war criminals as a law enforcement activity where you're saying you've been indicted, you're going to be arrested, and if not, an international force is going to come and take you to this court. Yeah. But it won't work unless the United States agrees to subject its own personnel. Assad is a war criminal. He should be sharing a cell with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld.
I'm laughing because I agree with you, but to have it put so succinctly is flawless. We have one more comment here. Actually, a few more comments, but this next comment is from Lisa. She said, "What can we do to save a free press so that these important issues can be discussed truthfully? Is it too consolidated?" I'll answer that, yes. And a few corporate owners. How can we stop them from parroting press releases? There has been a lot. The role of the media has been very significant in this, Jeremy. And our ability to, and when I say our, I mean the media, journalists, commentators, our ability to spin a narrative that really can obfuscate the reality of it. So I think this question is very timely. What do you think to her question about the role of media?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think that the overall analysis that she offers is true, as you just validated as well, Ben. You've got a small number of very wealthy individuals or corporations that are in control of a majority of the airwaves that actually belong to the public to disseminate what passes as news programming. And I think everybody is glad to see the despicable Bill O'Reilly falling. But the reality is that there are a lot of Bill O'Reillys, including at other networks. And if we're talking about misogyny and sexual harassment of women, I think that's probably way more pervasive than anyone ever that wants to talk about, particularly when you're talking about famous, powerful, rich white men at these media outlets and the way they treat the people that work under them. So I'm glad to see O'Reilly fall, but it doesn't really address the fact that Tucker Carlson now is going to be taking over for him. Yeah. And he has the same basic kind of reprehensible views on the world and dog whistling for, extremist right-wing causes. But on the flip side of it, I think that we're getting a window into what it could be like if we had an aggressive media culture in this country, because Trump is so kind of loathed by so many people, and because he's so cartoonishly kind of bad at his job. I do think you're seeing, the New York Times, the Washington Post, really getting back into the game. And, I don't want to heap too much praise on them, but it is interesting to see Chuck Todd once in a while asking tough questions, because that man wouldn't know a tough question if it came and shaved his goatee off. And all of a sudden now it's like Chuck Todd is Mr. like, we are a free press, and no, you're lying. And, but the thing is, I kind of think of it in the way that we cover school shootings in this country, whether it's at Newtown or we just had the anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting, the way that those are covered in terms of the victims. The Boston Marathon bombing as well. We knew the names of the dead. We heard the stories of the wounded. Films were made about the way that people rose up and to run in the marathon again. The teachers that threw themselves in front of their students in some of these school shootings. The beautiful drawing that the 8-year-old boy made who was killed in the marathon bombing. And to me, that's real. That's the kind of coverage we should be doing also of the victims of war.
Yeah.
Veterans who come back and are committing suicide in record numbers, or are walking around with prosthetic limbs. But really digging into how these wars have affected them. And I think that you have these moments in time, whether it's from a horrid tragedy like a school shooting or the presidency of Trump, where you start to see flashes of what it could be like if we actually took our job as journalists seriously. But my fear is that these are just episodic, moments, and that it's not really sticking. And so my answer for Lisa, I think, is I don't necessarily have a magic solution at all, but I do think the means of disseminating information are being democratized because of social media, because of what you and I are doing right now, Ben, because of how you ended up becoming a journalist and a talk show host, that citizen journalists who really take themselves seriously and their role in society seriously can actually make an impact. And that's a very different reality from 20 years ago, from the Vietnam War era, from World War II. We're in a time now where social media can be our worst enemy and our greatest ally. And I think finding a way to combine the old school muckraking with the energized, young, visionary creativity that is exhibited across social media platforms, and a lot of it comes from young people. And you look at the way people respond to the killing of black people in this country by police. This isn't some Al Sharpton-led centralized movement. In fact, it's not just one movement. A lot of times when you really on a granular level analyze how did people come to be out in the streets, a lot of it was from citizen journalists, word of mouth, people saying, no, this is the time we have to come out. And that's why I always say to people, like, those of us with getting gray and et cetera, we need to watch what young people are doing, particularly facing down against stormtrooper cops in this country, because they have something to teach all of us. The same is true in media. Legacy news organizations should, and they're starting to catch up to it, and now they're trying to recreate it. It's sort of like the Steve Buscemi meme where it's like, hello, young people. But I think listening is really important for those of us that have been in the game a while.
Yeah. Jeremy, listen, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We so much more that we should and can talk about, and so hopefully we could do it again.
Absolutely, my friend. Good seeing you, Ben, and thanks for doing this and all you do.
Hey, my pleasure. If you want to join in the conversation, give your feedback, 857-600-0518, or you can leave a comment in the Facebook chat. The conversation that Jeremy and I just had on Syria actually is a perfect segue into an interview that I had a chance to do earlier this week with Professor Lindsay O'Rourke of Boston College. She specializes in regime change. She's a professor of political science, international relations, international security, and she's done a deep dive into regime change, how often we've attempted it and how often we've failed. But more importantly, the conflict in the minds of politicians who continue to try regime change, even in the midst of the obvious evidence that suggests, well, let Lindsay speak about it. Professor O'Rourke, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me.
Would you outline for the audience Professor O'Rourke, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me.
Would you outline for the audience a brief definition of what you consider to be regime change, and give us some examples of the different methods that America has used?
Sure. I define covert regime change as an operation to replace the political leadership of another state where the intervening state does not intend for its role to become publicly known. So think of things like assassinations, coups, rigging foreign elections, or sponsoring foreign dissidents in their bids to topple a government. The problem, of course, with studying such operations is that, by definition, the intervening state, in my case, the United States, is trying to plausibly deny its role in the operation. So while some of these interventions have become very well known, think of the Bay of Pigs, the 1953 coup in Iran, the 1954 coup in Guatemala, in other cases, there's a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories surrounding them. So to cut through that, I did several years of archival research in the National Archives, National Security Archives, several presidential libraries, to come up with a data set of all the times the United States attempted covert regime change during the Cold War, and what I found was 66 examples.
So out of the 66 examples of regime change, how would you define a successful regime change, and what is our success rate?
Yeah, so I looked at both short-term success, just in terms of whether the regime was replaced or not, and long-term success, the long-term repercussions of the operation. Just looking at short-term success, I found that only 26 out of the 66 covert regime change attempts actually succeeded in replacing the target government. That's about a 40% success rate.
Wow.
So, in the other 40 cases, they actually failed to even topple the target regime.
Wow. So by our own definition of success, a successful regime change, 40 times we failed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Wow. So if we understand, if we have the data and we understand how unsuccessful we are at even instituting regime change, and we have leaders like John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and even Hillary Clinton who support this policy, why would our leaders continuously go after a policy that we can demonstrate is flawed and unsuccessful?
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer lies in the appeal of regime change. You have these chronic interstate disputes with another state where you're repeatedly trying to coerce them to do your bidding. Regime change offers the possibility of, sort of breaking that cycle, installing a leader who will then act as a puppet for you in perpetuity. So, an adversary becomes a friend. It's a very appealing premise. And you have to remember, in many of these cases, that foreign leader who's trying to get the United States to back them is often talking to U.S. policymakers and maybe exaggerating the base of support that they have in their country, exaggerating how closely their interests overlap with the United States. And I find, unfortunately for U.S. policymakers, that it tends not to work as they expect.
So it's the tempting allure of being able to solve our problems just by changing a regime versus alternatives like conflict. And so it's drawn in policy leaders, policymakers, generation after generation. And your research has shown that we are just not successful at it. Even in the ones that were successful, what does success actually look like?
Well, it tends not to be, in very few cases does the country become a reliable ally of the United States. Unfortunately, what happens in many cases, the U.S. goes in, they install the foreign leader who then comes to power, and they realize that they face the same exact political pressures as their predecessor who was overthrown by the United States. And oftentimes they feel the same incentives to go against the U.S. interest, either because there's powerful domestic constituencies that demand they behave a certain way, or their geopolitical environment. They soon discover that they're in this catch-22 position. Either they turn against the United States in order to appease their domestic audiences, or they ignore their domestic audiences and act at the behest of the United States. I find the only leaders who are to do so tends to be the ones that are highly reliant on the United States to maintain their position in power. But this often generates a lot of domestic unrest in that country, resentment against that leader for being a puppet of the United States. And in fact, in more than half of the cases, the U.S.-backed leaders are actually violently overthrown from domestic forces.
So even in the cases where we are, quote unquote, successful, half of those cases end up in a violent overthrow, a coup, or even civil war.
That's correct, yes.
Wow. So, oftentimes we hear in the United States the premise of humanitarianism or the need to spread democracy as a justification for even attempting regime change. And I'm wondering, in your research, have you found any type of consistent trend? Is it economic? Is it ideological? Is it a combination of the two with the pushback against communism? What is the underlying trend that you found as to why we attempt these regime changes?
Well, in my sample of Cold War cases, I found that national security interests were the dominant force. Either the United States was trying to fracture the Soviet alliance, prevent a communist regime from coming to power in the first place. I found very little evidence of humanitarian interventions. In fact, I can't think of a single case where the U.S. intervened for humanitarian purposes during the regime change, during the Cold War. In fact, in many cases, we were actually supporting groups that we knew had committed crimes against humanity. Similarly, our track record for promoting democracy is not very good. During the Cold War, we overthrew 6 democratic governments and replaced them with authoritarian leaders, such as in Guatemala, or Iran, or Chile. In another dozen cases, we intervened into democratic countries to try and influence the results of their election. So at least on the covert level, there doesn't seem to be much support for the theory that the United States pursues regime change to promote democracy.
Despite what we're told, despite the general language around operations of this magnitude, you found no real thread of humanitarianism.
No, unfortunately not.
The BBC recently reported a resurgence in the slave trade in Libya, and they tied it directly to the NATO ousting of Muammar Gaddafi. I wanted to know, in your research, what have you found in terms of what happens on a human rights level after we've committed a regime change or instituted a regime change? What have you found, and how does it work out for the people there?
Well, unfortunately, the effects for the target states can be really devastating. I found the states that experienced regime change were less likely to be democratic afterwards, more likely to experience civil war, more likely to experience mass killings. And there's really two pathways to violence here. For the operations that fail, I find that the U.S. intervention has the effect of adding fuel to a fire. You know, we're adding arms and aid to rebel groups who try to topple the foreign government. They're unsuccessful in that bid, and the target government often, tries to crack down on its domestic opponents, which can lead to civil war or civilian victimization. Interestingly, even in the cases where they succeed and they replace the target government, the regime change itself often has the effect of weakening that country's political institutions. And as I mentioned before, we tend to install leaders without a widespread base of support in their own country. And so that oftentimes engenders resentment, which can lead to civil war and widespread rebellion. In more than 40% of the successful cases, you end up with civil war in the target countries anyway.
So I find this data I find this data fascinating because we have so many conversations going on right now about the possibility of regime change, and yet the evidence is overwhelmingly suggesting that we're not good at it, and even when we are successful, it causes more problems than it fixes. So, we've explored the trap that politicians get into. It's a very appealing idea, an appealing concept. But in reality, we create more problems than good. What do we do then? What do these policymakers do? Because if you take Syria, for example, it's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do we leave a dictator in who has demonstrated that he will use chemical weapons on his populations? Or do we risk a regime change that could, based on the data, make things worse?
Yeah, I wish I could say that regime change had a better track record. It's, it's personally upsetting to say that, in some cases we might have to leave dictators in power, but the data suggests that, overall it makes the situation worse. And I think it's just, we have to recognize the fundamental limits to American military power and what we're able to, social engineer from abroad, and realize that in some of these countries, they're going to have to resolve their domestic disputes internally without American help.
And you have an article coming out that you're working on that's coming out soon entitled A Fool's Errand, and you discuss specifically Syria, about how even though we're in a hard place, between a rock and a hard place, we really could make a bad situation worse. Is there anything unique about Syria that makes you feel that way, or is this based solely on our track record?
Well, Syria is sort of a worst-case scenario situation. You have, this multi-sided conflict. It's hard to identify, a widespread moderate opposition that the United States could support. In the past, when we supported some of these groups that we thought were friendly, in some cases they've split and joined Al-Qaeda and other groups. And so, just how fractured the opposition is doesn't help. Also, there's not a good plan moving forward. Even if the United States is successful at removing Assad from power, whoever we helped to install and come to power would have a lot of trouble maintaining control over the population. It would likely just lead to a second round of civil war and potentially a backlash against the Alawite population, which is currently supporting Assad, and an ethnic cleansing there. And so there's just no clear path moving forward to how this could easily work, unfortunately.
That was Professor Lindsay O'Rourke of Boston College outlining the track record, the data on regime change. And I find it so fascinating that this is a conversation that we really rarely hear, that we're not good at regime change. And when we do it, we often leave the nations in worse conditions than what we found them. So how do you choose between two horrible choices? How do you deal with the reality that any choice that you make can inevitably lead to a bad result for not only you, but the people involved? In many respects, this is what the international community is facing when we consider the options in Syria. I mean, to be clear, Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal, a brutal dictator who has used chemical weapons on fellow Syrians in order to maintain his grip on power. However, history has proven that whenever the United States attempts a regime change, we more than often not make horrible situations worse, not only for the people living in the nation, but also for Americans. And this is where we are. When we consider our options of how to proceed in Syria, there are no good solutions. There is no easy fix. There are no number of bombs or troops that we can deploy to fix Syria. So how do we choose between two bad decisions? On the one hand, continue to allow a dictator to use brutal force to maintain his grip on power, or risk the disastrous side effects of regime change, side effects that can often lead to even greater human rights violations than perpetrated by the very people we sought to remove. The sobering reality is that in the case of Syria, there may be nothing that America can do. And while that may fly in the face of people, quite honestly, like me, who I'm too stubborn to look at the reality and accept the fact that there may be no solution to a particular problem, perhaps accepting that reality, that there is no solution that America can institute, maybe that's the very best solution in and of itself. So what do we do when there's nothing that we can do? Well, perhaps the only thing that we can do is to actually be humanitarians, the humanitarians that we purport to be. We should accept refugees from all of the war-torn nations that in reality we help to destabilize. It's not only the best thing that we can do, it is our moral responsibility to do it. And then if our example, the things that we do and the way that we carry ourselves as a nation and the reputation that we have on the international stage and the domestic stage, when that reputation begins to align with what we talk about, with our ideas, when the America that we sing and write songs about, that we hope for, the America that we imagine, and to be frank, not the America that currently exists, but the America that we hope for, when our actions ever begin to align with those values, then we will find that our solution is not in what we can do with our military might, but perhaps it's in the example that other nations would want to imitate. Up next, a brief conversation on Bill O'Reilly and his ousting at Fox News with Professor Matt Sienkiewicz of Boston College. Professor Sienkiewicz, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Hey, Ben.
Do me a favor, lean in a little bit more into that microphone.
How's that?
Oh, that's even better. That's
Excellent.
even better.
Yeah.
We're making a hard shift here from Syria.
Well, yes, but we're both talking about broken systems.
Yeah,
We're talking about aspects of American politics and culture that don't work, right?
Yeah.
The way that we have structured media, I think, is a problem.
Yeah.
It's not at the same level, of course, as this regime change question, but what we see here at Fox News is certainly, it goes back to sort of presumptions built into American society and the way we understand the world that lead us into problematic places like, this sort of purely commercial-driven system of news, which has a real political impact, right?
Yeah.
It can impact who becomes president, and that can be so commercially oriented that we can have somebody like Bill O'Reilly lasting through all these
lasting through everything that he did to help get us into Iraq.
Sure.
Lasting through all that he's done, all that he said, all the dog whistles, all of the
sometimes just direct racism.
direct racism, all of the soft white supremacy and sometimes outright white supremacy.
Sometimes direct
I mean,
calls for
it's all of the things that he's done. It took us to get to this point to actually see his career end. And you know, I saw somebody online. You know, I try to stay offline now, but someone's saying that we shouldn't celebrate the demise of his career. But I disagree. He's been such a huge contributing factor to a lot of the problems being unresolved. Like I said at the beginning, like some people make their careers off of stunting the discussion when they know they know. I'm not on my show, so I can't really. I wanted to cuss there because Bill O'Reilly has been just integral in stopping progress. So why should we mourn the end of a career of a person who's intentionally put there to undermine any progress?
Well, we shouldn't mourn for two reasons. One, I'm not sure this career is over. Right there, he certainly got to a point where the Murdochs decided that the scales tipped. Right, that does not mean he's not commercially viable. Right, the American media system has been, especially in the news sector, has been increasingly based on dividing up audiences. Right, getting a tighter and tighter grip on a smaller and smaller audience. Right, he can downshift from Fox News and find an audience somewhere. Yeah. So that's the first thing, right? There's no reason to believe this guy's gone away.
I want to stop you there. Don't speak anything too positive. Like we want him to go away.
Oh no, we want him to go away. There's no question about it. But
realistically,
it's the scariest thing about it is that this is not a death sentence for him in terms of his career. Secondly, we really shouldn't celebrate it insofar as this decision to oust him had nothing to do with ethics, nothing to do with journalism, nothing to do with morality. Right, it just had to do with competing notions of capital, basically. Yeah. Right, the Murdoch sons, James and Lachlan, they decided they were more interested in sort of appearing presentable, perhaps. Right, they were trying to get rid of him because in the long run they thought it was sort of bad for business. Right.
Right. Well, actually, in the short run. Right, in the short run, right, they lost, I believe, almost 60 sponsors, and even
from the show. Right.
It's
true that at this point they had just shifted their money over into other shows. And, you can't be certain they wouldn't have drifted back for sure. I mean, there's sort of this competing the long-term brand element of it versus Rupert's just counting the money, right? The dad who's it turned out that ultimately I think that both sides decided that this was bad, right? There was a short-term loss in terms of potential sponsorship and a long-term loss, but that's because James and Lachlan are not ashamed of his racism. Right. They're not ashamed of his verbal misogyny, right? The things that he says on the air. They're not afraid of his pretty overt white nationalism. In terms of, he talks about the demise of the white power world. Scary stuff, right? That's not a problem. Right. That wasn't going to mess them up.
So you're pointing out a lot of things here that I think we need to double back on and unpack. Right. So he's only being put out not even because of $13 million.
Oh, that's nothing.
They show that they're willing to stand behind him. Yeah. Right. They will stand behind him even $13 million above what they already pay him. Sure. So they have no problem with his misogyny, no problem with the allegations. They only have a problem with the fact that this is a huge PR thing from the right now and that it's financially inconvenient for that time slot, and maybe they can find some other ways to make. So I like what you said. It's like it's competing capital frameworks, right? Yeah. Of why he would go. The only other question that I would have then is where does Fox go from here? Right, because their brand is not really sullied, but
it's the brand. I mean, the brand seems hard to sully after Roger Ailes. Exactly, and the fact that the ratings were still good this week, despite all that. That said, this is like Disney firing Mickey Mouse, right? Not to not to cast aspersions on Mickey, right? But this has been he's the flagship, right? He is the face of it. There was a lot of talk. Oh, what's going to happen when Ailes leaves? Well, the reality is Ailes is replaceable. Right, the behind-the-scenes types can be replaced. This isn't to say they can't develop a new personality, but it's awfully telling that they haven't, since 1996, really developed a second personality on the level. There's Hannity, who I do not think has the same breadth of appeal. Right. I mean, it's telling, right?
Well, so what's appealing, and this is something that I really have tracked with Bill O'Reilly for a long time. What's appealing about Bill O'Reilly is that he's able to sneak in the messages of white supremacy, racism, sexism, uber nationalism, and he's able to sneak it in a nice and moderately dignified fashion. Right, he looks, to people who would watch him, right? They may be easily impressed by his demeanor, his presentation, and all the while he's quite literally saying the same things that you would get out of a Richard Spencer. I remember when he was talking to John McCain back in 2007, and he said that America was built by, America is run by white Christian men. And immediately after that, he began to lament the browning of America, right? So he sneaks in white genocide, but in a nice, dignified fashion, and speaking to, you know, a candidate who was running for president at the time. So here is his appeal. The question is, can Fox News actually find someone else who can cross that threshold of seamlessly going back and forth between being a dog whistle, outright racist, sexist, misogynist, and simultaneously doing it with his $2,000 suit on?
No, it's tough, right? And the key to Fox News has been, for the most part, looking like a legitimate news outlet, right? Giving the trappings, having the graphic package, and the Bill O'Reilly type, you know, sort of visually reminds you of a classic newsman, something along these lines, but incorporating that into the sort of crazy regressive politics that they have. You know, there's nobody on that channel at the moment. I mean, I think they're moving Tucker Carlson, who does not have the same
He pales in comparison.
I mean, it's worth noting though that this guy's 67 years old, O'Reilly, and it's hard to imagine a younger character taking up that position.
It's not for me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being optimistic. I'm not saying they can't be awful in a different way.
Yeah.
But the sort of, I mean, you know, I hate sort of the sort of throwing Mad Men as a term, right? It's, But that sort of blind misogynistic patriarchy. It's very hard to pull that off if you're a little bit younger. It doesn't mean you can't find other ways to be awful.
That's interesting.
But the obliviousness that O'Reilly has is something about his generation.
I want to play this brief clip of one of my favorite clips of Bill O'Reilly, and I say that obviously tongue-in-cheek. Let's listen into this real quick.
How are you going to get jobs for them? Many of them are ill-educated and have tattoos on their foreheads, and you know, how are you going to, and I hate to be generalized about it, but it's true. If you look at all the educational statistics, how are you going to give jobs to people who aren't qualified for jobs?
So we didn't get a context for it, but he's talking about African Americans. And he's talking about the fact that underneath President Obama, African Americans did poorly, et cetera, et cetera. And then he comes in with this, well, I don't want to overgeneralize, but you just overgeneralize in one of the most racist fashions possible. This is the art form that Bill O'Reilly specializes in. And, you know, for anyone who's lamenting his career demise, you know, I have nothing to say.
Absolutely. The only thing to lament here is the fact that this is where our sort of journalistic, I call them journalists might be a bit much, but our sort of public affairs system has taken us. Yeah. Right. The utter unfettered nature of it, and it has brought us to here where we have. I mean, this is it's pure ideological sort of charlatanism, right? I mean, there's no content there, but it feels good, it looks good. And we don't have much. We're getting there. This show, right? There are alternatives that are developing, right? But the fact is, the sort of main thrust of American news and public affairs is about finding an audience, small but not too small, and pumping them with what they already think. And you know, there are other systems out there, and this is the system that we're in. Hopefully, you know, some of the new forms of communication are going to help us not get further into it. But you know, that's where he's at.
Well, that's Bill O'Reilly. Professor Matt Sienkiewicz, Boston College, Professor of Media Studies. You've been on my show quite a few times. I'm so glad that you could join me tonight.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And we want to hear from you, 857-600-0518, to leave your voicemail and also your comments in the comments section. We're going to pull up a couple of questions here, a couple of comments here, so that we can talk about what you want to talk about, because that's a key component of what we do, is to get you involved, because more than anything else, your opinion, your voice, and your questions, they absolutely matter. So we have a couple of questions coming up here. This is from Charles. This is the journalistic equivalent of a super group. I didn't expect that one, Matt. That's not a question, but I love the way
very, very kind.
They snuck that in there on us. Okay, let's go to a question. Thank you, Charles. I do appreciate it. The next question that's coming up here. This is from Sarah. The main question about Syria is, how can we trust information out of the region when a good portion is controlled by Al Qaeda and other Salafist group? That's a tough one. That, you know what, I think, and I hate to use cliches, but it's not a cliche. What Jeremy said in his interview earlier is that we as citizens, you may trust and verify. As journalists, we have to distrust, and then go out and seek evidence. And I think that in any situation that we shouldn't accept something that's being said. A matter of fact, don't accept anything that we say at face value, right? Sure. Investigate for yourself. Obviously, you're not going to be able to look at the body of evidence directly, but the people that you listen to what extent do they investigate?
Yeah, and there are good open source journalists out there, people who are particularly doing video forensics and these sorts of things where they are trying to show you the process of their journalistic activity. And they're out there, and of course you got to be, you have to trust them to a certain extent, and you have to decide, who you do trust. However, the one sort of minor glimmering hope is that given the potential for things like video forensics and sort of triangulation stuff people do with online tools, you can sometimes hear an argument and feel like you've seen enough evidence to move forward, at least with a tentative belief. Right?
Yeah, and also
and that's new.
Another comment that I saw, that to trust citizen journalism, I think that's a key component, right? There are people who are putting their lives, not in every case, right? There are some examples of citizen journalists who are actually masterful propagandists, but there are people who put their lives on the line just to cover a story, and they're not a part of any big news bureau.
Right, and there also are people who, they're not putting their lives on the line, but are devoting tremendous time to sorting through citizen journalist reports and trying to put them together, sort out the true from the false, and they're out there, and it takes a lot of work, right? It's not easy news consumption, and it's not going to get you a full picture, but you're absolutely right. Citizen journalists are absolutely crucial sources, and the people who take the time to take the two videos and put them together and see if they make sense, if they go together, you'll find reporters doing that, you'll find volunteers doing that, and it's worth seeking out. It's not going to give you an overall picture of the whole story, but it will help. Absolutely.
Well, listen, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this initial broadcast for the Intercept Live. Special thanks to everyone at the Intercept. If I start naming names, it would be difficult, but Jeremy, to Lauren, to Glenn, to all of you at the Intercept that has made this possible, and particularly to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for all of your input and your insight, and we hope to do this again with you soon. Have a good night.